A doctor is supposed to save lives. For decades, the people of Hyde, Greater Manchester, did exactly what they were taught to do. When they felt unwell, when their parents grew frail, when an elderly neighbor needed care, they called their doctor. They opened their doors to him. They rolled up their sleeves. They trusted him completely. And one by one, many of them died. Not violently, not suspiciously, at least not at first. Quietly, in armchairs, in beds, in the middle of ordinary afternoons, death certificates were signed. Families grieved. Life moved on. Nobody thought to ask why so many of his patients seemed to be dying faster and more often than anyone else's. By the time investigators finally began asking that question, they weren't just looking at a handful of unusual deaths. They were staring at what would become one of the largest serial killing cases in modern British history, and the man responsible for it had spent nearly 3 decades hiding in plain sight, wearing a white coat. To understand how this happened, you have to start not with suspicion, but with trust. Harold Shipman was a respected general practitioner. He ran a busy practice, he made house calls, he sat at kitchen tables and in living rooms across his community, taking pulses, listening to complaints, reassuring frightened families. To his patients, he was not a stranger in a hospital corridor. He was the man who came to them in their own homes when they were at their most vulnerable. This is important. A family doctor occupies a unique position in a community. He is present at the beginning of illness and, often, at its end. His signature is what turns a death into an official, explainable event. Nobody questions the doctor. Nobody is trained to, which is exactly why, for years, nobody did. Gradually, in the background, a pattern was forming. Elderly patients under Shipman's care were dying in unusually high numbers, and often in circumstances that, examined individually, seemed unremarkable. A visit, a sudden collapse, a certificate signed on the spot. Each death, on its own, looked like nothing more than the sad but expected end of an elderly life. It was only when these deaths were considered together, rather than one at a time, that something began to look wrong. The truth is, the systems meant to catch something like this were not built for a trusted doctor operating alone. Death certification in Britain relied heavily on a physician's word. Cremation forms required a second doctor's signature, but that second doctor often knew little more than what the first doctor told them. Suspicion of natural causes was the default assumption, not the exception. A man in Shipman's position was not just unlikely to be questioned. He was, in a sense, protected by the very structure designed to prevent this kind of thing. The Shipman Inquiry would later spend years examining exactly how these gaps allowed his crimes to continue undetected. But in the late 1990s, nobody yet understood the scale of what was happening. They only knew something felt wrong. Then, in June 1998, everything changed. Kathleen Grundy, an elderly and active former mayoress of Hyde, was found dead at her home. On its surface, it looked like another natural death, another patient who had simply passed away under the care of her trusted doctor. But her daughter, a solicitor named Angela Woodruff, discovered something that did not add up. A will had surfaced, apparently written by her mother, that left her entire estate to one person, Harold Shipman. Angela Woodruff knew her mother. She knew her mother's habits, her intentions, her relationship with her own family. This was not right, and because she was a solicitor herself, she knew exactly how to act on that instinct. This is the moment the story stops being about suspicious deaths in general, and starts being about one specific, provable question: was this will real? Police began an investigation, and Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed. What they found inside her tissue changed the entire direction of the case. Traces of morphine, a drug that had no business being there. A death that had looked entirely natural was suddenly, undeniably, not. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested. What happened next was not the end of the story. It was the moment investigators realized how much larger the story actually was. Because once Shipman's name was attached to a forged will and a morphine-laced body, they had to ask an uncomfortable question. How many other deaths, quietly certified over the years, deserved a second look? Investigators began pulling old patient records, cremation forms, prescription histories. Case after case that had once seemed unremarkable was reopened and re-examined. Some had been treated as routine, some had barely raised an eyebrow at the time. Slowly, a pattern that had been invisible for years began to take shape on paper. And there was something else, something that would later become one of the most painful parts of the entire case. In March 1998, months before Kathleen Grundy's death, a local doctor had already raised concerns about the unusually high number of deaths among Shipman's patients. Police investigated, and they concluded there was nothing to it. The Shipman Inquiry later found that at least 3 more patients died after that failed investigation. Patients who, under different circumstances, might have lived. It is one of the most sobering questions the case leaves behind. Could he have been stopped sooner? In 1999, Harold Shipman stood trial, charged with murdering 15 patients and with forging Kathleen Grundy's will. The prosecution built its case on medical records, toxicology, and the physical evidence of the will itself. It was not a case built on confession. Shipman never admitted to what he had done. On January 31, 2000, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. For the public, that might have felt like the end. 15 victims, 1 convicted killer, justice served. But investigators and officials knew the number 15 was almost certainly not the whole truth. It was simply what could be proven, case by case, in a courtroom. The real question, the one that had been growing quietly since Kathleen Grundy's exhumation, remained unanswered. How many people had Harold Shipman actually killed? To answer it, the British government established the Shipman Inquiry, tasked with investigating the full extent of his crimes and the failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. In 2002, the first phase of that inquiry delivered a number that shocked the country. Not 15, at least 215. And the inquiry wasn't finished. It went further back, into Shipman's earliest years as a junior doctor, long before he ran his own practice. When the final report was published, it concluded that Harold Shipman had likely killed approximately 250 patients between 1971 and 1998. Of those, 218 victims were positively identified. 218 people, ordinary people in an ordinary town who called their doctor because they trusted him to help them. That is the number that makes this case almost impossible to comprehend. Not a single act of violence, but a pattern repeated for nearly 3 decades, hidden inside a role built entirely on trust. The inquiry didn't stop at counting victims. It examined, in painstaking detail, exactly how this had been allowed to happen. It looked at how death certificates were issued, at how cremation approvals worked, at how coroners handled unexplained deaths, at how controlled drugs like morphine were monitored or weren't, at how complaints about doctors were investigated or dismissed. Its recommendations reshaped several of these systems in the years that followed, because in the end, this was never only the story of one man. It was the story of an environment that made his crimes possible and slow to detect. But somewhere underneath the numbers, the reports, and the reforms, there are 218 people who deserve to be remembered as more than a statistic. They were patients, parents, grandparents, neighbors, people who lived ordinary lives and trusted the one person who was supposed to protect them at their most fragile moments. For years, the people of Hyde saw Harold Shipman as the doctor who came when they needed help. By the time investigators uncovered the truth, that trust had become part of the evidence against him. The most disturbing part of this case was never simply how many people died. It was how long their deaths were allowed to look ordinary.